So I'm addicted to crime. So just how did this happen? This is a terrible addiction. Well, doing family history, how else do you think? Doing the family history, what did I discover? I discovered I had a horse thief in the family. John David Gambold, he was transported to New South Wales. He was the cousin of my great-great-grandfather, and he was born in 1811 in a parish just north of Haverfordwest in Pembrokeshire. In 1832, in the April of that year, he was arrested in Pontypridd, selling a pony to a butcher. He was taken to Monmouth Castle, and in August, he was tried at Monmouth Assizes and sentenced to be transported for the rest of his natural life. He was sent to the hulks at Woolwich, and in December, he was put on board a convict transport ship called the Mangles, which sailed for Sydney, arriving there in April 1833. From the indents of the Mangles. Now the indents are effectively like the manifest, which sort of lists the convicts, and gives you an amazing amount of information if you can read them, because they look like that. And John is the fifth one down there. It tells you their age, whether they're married, if they're married, how many children they've got, how many boys, how many girls, what their native place was, what their trade or calling, their offences, where they were tried, when they were tried, previous convictions. It then gives you a very, very detailed physical description, because obviously it predates photographs or fingerprints, so you needed to be able to identify them if they escaped. So I know he was 5'5" tall. He had ruddy complexion, black hair, hazel eyes, a scar on his right eyebrow, 2 small moles on the back of his upper right arm, 2 inside his lower right arm, and one mole on the back of his lower left arm. Thankfully, the kind folks in the archives of New South Wales actually transcribed these indents, so they're far easier to read. And they also give you a colonial history, which were those numbers that were written underneath the names, if you noticed. So you could learn a lot more information about their lives in Australia. So I know that in 1843, he married an Irish free immigrant called Mary Ann Moore. And that in 1845, he was granted a form of parole, which was called a ticket of leave. And that ticket of leave was a piece of paper which said, this is what you're allowed to do. You're allowed to travel within these certain prescribed areas. And that also enabled him to earn some money for himself. Because when you arrived in Australia as a convict, you had to work for a master, be it a government master or a private individual. And this ticket of leave enabled him to travel with an entire horse between Windsor and Mudgee in the service of Mr. Rouse for 12 months. He and Mary Ann had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who he named after his parents. Neither unfortunately survived infancy. And in 1847, he was granted a conditional pardon. The conditionality was that he could go anywhere in the world except return to the United Kingdom. There, the records might have ended, but for another thing that came online, which was newspapers. In Australia, you can access newspapers virtually free of charge through the Australian Archives, a thing called Trove. I discovered a shipping list in December 1849 with him sailing from Sydney with his wife for San Francisco via Auckland, and they arrived in San Francisco in May 1850. Again, I found nothing for a very long time about what they were doing in America. But in November 1868, this is through Ancestry, I discovered that he had applied for US citizenship in Northern California. I never found out what happened to him in California, but it always struck me as a remarkable tale that this was a Pembrokeshire farm labourer who'd gone all 3/4 of the way around the world. And I thought that was a remarkable story. And it got me to wondering whether or not any of these other convicts had done anything similar. And because the record is sitting me there in front of me with all their names and all that, what they've done, and and all the records, a lot of the records are online. Excuse me. I started poking around, and before very long, I got a pile of paper about 2 inches thick. So what was I going to do with it? I wrote a book called Transported. And basically, it's the pen portraits of it. There were 236 convicts on the mangles, and there's a pen portrait of each of the convicts, and that's a picture of the mangles. But in order to write the book, I actually had to do more than just investigate each of the convicts. I had to research the ins and outs of transportation, the 19th century criminal justice system, and in doing so, I made a number of surprising discoveries. Firstly, about the literacy of convicts. On the mangles, I think about half of the convicts would fall into, the majority of with the literacy. I'll start again. The majority of the convicts could at least read. It was a minority who could neither read nor write. And that really surprised me in 1832. With trades, about half the convicts would fall into the unskilled labour bracket. About 1/3 were skilled. The rest came from a vast range of trades. There were people like chemists, druggists. There was an excise officer. There were merchants, jewellers, a jockey. There were soldiers who'd been court-martialed. The ages, there was a range of ages went from 13 to 54. Enormous numbers that had tattoos. It was very popular for people to have blue rings tattooed on themselves. Some of them had enormous amounts of tattoos. What they tattooed themselves with, I hate to think. What they used as ink and the implements they used to tattoo themselves. I should think hepatitis must have been rife. There were those who'd been transported before. You'd have thought once was enough, but apparently not. There were lots who had relatives that had been transported. The sheer cost of the criminal justice system, it's astronomical. The number of original documents that have survived. And I found 4 out of the 236 who definitely returned to the UK. But there probably were more, but those are the 4 that I can actually prove returned to the UK. And I sort of came up with a little summary of this. And there are a few other issues on this slide, in addition to the ones I've mentioned. And I think ones that strike me as the most poignant, if you like, on this are in terms of the families left behind. You can see that there were 46 married men and 11 widowers, and then between them they left 133 children behind. One of the men, the records show that his wife and children were in a poorhouse waiting to be removed back to her home parish. The problem with the records is they never mention the wife's name, they just say Mrs. So-and-so. They never give the children's names. So you'd never be able to determine what happened to them. But they're the unknown victims of all of this. They're the tragedies that are never really written about. And I'd love to know more about them, but unfortunately you won't. In terms of the relatives on the mangles, those were 2 brothers who were transported for the same crime. What I would like to do now is to very quickly give you some examples of the different types of convicts that I've talked about in the stories, either from the mangles or from some of the other work that I've been looking at, because I've been thinking about maybe writing another book. So I've been doing some bits of research which are a bit scatterbrained, but hopefully they'll be interesting to you. So this is John Lucock, who's one of the convicts who was transported twice. He was a 24-year-old Birmingham labourer who in July 1826 was convicted of burglary at Warwick and sentenced to 7 years transportation. But he actually spent 6 years on a prison hulk at Woolwich and then was released in 1832. But the prison hulk regime was very, very arduous. It was not a soft option at all. So he was never actually transported, but he just spent 6 years down in Woolwich on the hulks. And within 2 months of being released, he was back in court in Coventry, charged with breaking and entry, and being sentenced to being transported for life. So obviously, either it was destitution or he just was a bad one. I don't know which, never will do. After arriving in New South Wales in 1841, he married Jane Atkinson, who was also a convict, and she was from Sunderland. He was granted a pardon in 1850. In 1856, a government notice was issued charging him with deserting his wife. He'd gone gold prospecting. She died in 1868 and he died in 1875. So neither never left Australia. This is about the cost of the justice system. And this is the prosecutor, on the right, you've got the prosecutor's bill for prosecuting Thomas Cribbs, who was a cotton spinner who got 7 years transportation for housebreaking and stealing clothes. So John Stanfield was the prosecutor, and he was paid £27, 15 shillings and twopence for 3 felony prosecutions, so roughly £9 a prosecution. So a lot of money in 1832. And if you look at the prosecutor's bill, you can see how, if you like, mechanised it was, because it's all pre-printed, all the charges are preset, and I don't know if you can make it out, but in actual fact, they're almost like paid a bonus. So if the felons are found guilty, and whether or not they're transported. So there's an incentive. The more you find them guilty, the more you transport. If they get them transported, you get more money. Thomas Cribbs was last heard of in Newcastle Jail in New South Wales in 1853, serving 3 months for with hard labour. So that's mechanized. That's how much the sort of, if you multiply that by the number of convicts, it amounts up. And the next slide is following on from that. This is not related to the Mangles, but this was something I found in a newspaper doing some other research. And this is the Treasurer's accounts for the town of Brecon between 1813 and 1819. And it basically says that they received £746 in those 6 years. And then from there, you can pick out the various expenses, most of which go to repairing bridges and roads. But this is the elements that they paid out for, if you like, crime and punishment. So you've got bread for prisoners in the town jail, bread for the town prisoners in the county jail, how much it costs them to prosecute felons, for apprehending vagrants, the ward and watch expenditure, which is effectively the police force, and then it cost them £11 just to take a convict to Woolwich. So in total, they spent 25% of the town's income on crime and punishment. That's a phenomenal amount of money. I think that's probably higher than we spend a day on crime and punishment. This is the story of one of the convicts who came home. He was 19 years old. He was a brickmaker's labourer from Liverpool, got lots of previous convictions. And he was convicted at Chester in 1832 of stealing a coat and got 7 years. The convict records from one of the hulks give you his mother's address. I don't know any other records that you can get from 1832 where you'd get a labourer's address in that much detail. So this is another good thing for if you've got a criminal in your family. You get really, you can often find huge amounts of detail that you wouldn't find from your law-abiding ancestors. He was freed in 1839 and married Anne Byrne, and she was a convict from Dublin. In September 1849, an advert was placed in the New South Wales Government Gazette asking anybody knew about him to contact the Colonial Secretary's office, because people from England were looking for him. And obviously nobody answered it, because in December 1852, there was an advert in the Sydney Morning Herald. And that's the advert. And the advert says that if anybody can prove the handwriting of a Gilbert Cummings who worked in the dockyard in Liverpool, or of an Eliza Welch and a Margaret Martindale who were Willis's sisters, they should contact John Dillon, who was a solicitor in Sydney. From what I've been able to determine, Cummings was related to the Willesey family by marriage, and he was a merchant who traded through Liverpool. And I think he'd probably been persuaded to financially back the search for Willesey and pay his fare home. Anne Byrne died in 1858. I don't know when Edward returned home, but by 1861 he was living with Margaret and her family in Liverpool, and that was in the census. And then he died in 1864 in Liverpool. Now, this particular story, John Potter, who escaped and won a pardon, is probably, in my view, the most remarkable tale from the convicts on the Mangles. He was a foundling in Shrewsbury, born in 1815, brought up in the workhouse and then apprenticed to a carpenter. When he was about 16 years old, a journeyman printer came through Shrewsbury on his way to London, and Potter thought that was very exciting, so he ran away with him. They got as far as Wolverhampton when a journeyman printer robbed him of everything, leaving him destitute and penniless. For some bizarre reason, Potter made his way to Norwich, destitute. And in Norwich, he was arrested for vagrancy and sent to jail for 2 months. And whilst he was in jail for 2 months, he got jail fever. And jail fever was typhus. So he decided that he needed to try and mend his bridges and see if he could go back to Shrewsbury. So he wrote to the carpenter and asked to be forgiven and see if he could come home. And the carpenter wrote back saying, yes, you can come home. But he never got the letter from the carpenter. So when he left jail, he just decided it was worthwhile. He might as well try and go back to Shrewsbury. But he was still destitute, so he was living on his wits. And according to him, that's why he committed the burglary that led him to be in Shrewsbury Assizes in August 1832, being found guilty, sentenced to death, because burglary was a capital offence, which was then commuted to transportation for life. And this is all coming from his own, effectively, biography. He just tells us very little about his life in New South Wales, but after about 6 years, he had tried to escape and was under sentence of 2 years in irons, which is effectively working in a chain gang. But that had been mitigated to him going to work in the government timber yard in Parramatta. And Parramatta, for those who don't know, is upriver from Sydney. And from there he escaped, made his way to Sydney, and got on board an American sloop of war, signed articles, and sailed away free. The only thing he talks about in his life as a convict was he talked about the boundless depravity that he'd witnessed. It's quite tantalising, but nothing else than that. 3 months after escaping, the American sloop returned to Sydney, and the British officer recognised him, but he didn't know where from, so he got away. For the next 7 or 8 years, he sailed around the world. He worked at one time for the Hudson Bay Company and was sent to Africa. And then another ship he sailed from Greenock. And so he must have been going in and out of Greenock. And at that time, he became a Christian convert of such fervency that he felt he had to confess what he'd done. So he told the captain, the crew, and then when they reached Bombay, he went to see a free church missionary named Nesbitt, who went with him to the police magistrates, but they said they got no jurisdiction to act. The ship was going on to Calcutta, so Nesbitt gave him a letter of introduction to a missionary called MacDonald, who applied to the magistrates there, but they said the same as those in Bombay. He was then told he needed to either go to England or return to New South Wales, and that if he chose the latter, the missionaries would pay his passage. And that's what he wanted to do, but the captain wouldn't discharge him. And as the ship was going to England, that's where he went, with the ship sailing in May 1845. So he arrives in London, and the missionary MacDonald from India gave him a letter of introduction to the Reverend James Hamilton, the minister of the Presbyterian Church in Regent Square, London, and also to Sir John Pirrie, who had been the Lord Mayor of London in 1841-42, was a magistrate of the City of London and a director of the East India Company, and whose wife was a keen supporter of Elizabeth Fry, the prison reformer. The letter to Sir John Pirrie survives and was included in the petition for clemency that was submitted to the Home Secretary. Potter had in fact been living under an alias of George Stanton. Pirrie at this stage was very unwell and about to go abroad for his health, but he was convinced that Potter was a good candidate for a free pardon, being a fully reformed man and a committed Christian, owning up to his crimes, particularly as he would never have been detected but for his own confession. So Pirrie persuaded the Under-Sheriff of London, a man named D.W. Wire, to take up the case for him. So in addition to the efforts made on his behalf by Wire, there was a great deal of lobbying also done by Hamilton and the church elders from Greenock, where Potter had passed quite a bit of time before finally confessing who he really was. Sir James Graham, the Home Secretary, was first approached by Wire in November 1845, and he said he could do nothing whilst Potter was at liberty, and that Potter would have to surrender himself unconditionally. And that Potter did at the end of that month. And he was remanded to Newgate Prison, charged with returning from transportation before his term had expired. He went before the Old Bailey the next day, where he pled guilty and was sentenced to 3 months' prison plus transportation for life. His supporters continued to lobby for a free pardon, and this was granted to him on the 14th of February 1846. And the last record of him was a mention in a Christian Treasure article, which I've been effectively paraphrasing, which said that he'd given up the sea and settled in business in town in one of the distant colonies, but it didn't tell you which colony he'd gone to. So as I say, I thought that was quite a remarkable tale. So what next for me? Will I write another book about what? Women? Because there's no women on Mangles. Location specific? Well, the convicts on the Mangles, they came from all over the United Kingdom. Came from the Isle of Man as well. One came from Guyana. He was transported back from Guyana to London, then off to New South Wales. Or more than just transportation, other forms of punishment over a longer period of time. So let's have a look at women quickly. You know, were they treated differently from men? Yes, is the answer in short order. All convicts were seen as being right at the bottom of the social order, but women were seen even lower than that. They were seen almost as being morally corrupt, particularly in the early days. And they probably weren't. They were seen, particularly at the turn of the 18th century, as being prostitutes, but most of them weren't prostitutes. They were seen as being there to provide gratification for both guards and convicts. And later on, they actually brought in rules to stop them being treated as that. So regulations were brought in to stop the transport ships being treated, I quote, as becoming sail-driven brothels. There is lots I could go on to about, but I shan't because we haven't got enough time about this. But they also had some fairly degrading punishments for women that misbehaved. They would shave their heads. And they invented this particular gruesome piece of equipment called the iron collar. And can you imagine having that put on you and being expected to wear that for endless days? You can't sleep in that. Men didn't get that. Yes, men get flogged, but women did get beaten as well. One of the differences, which you might say is a positive, I'm not quite certain if it was or not, was women could take their small children with them. That's probably so they didn't get left as a burden on the parish rather than being kind. As I say, women were often preached at because of their perceived lack of morals. And when, rather than being, they didn't call them houses of correction or prisons in Australia, they called them factories. And often they would get preachers and worthy individuals to go and lecture the women about their morals. And there is a very famous cartoon where the women rebelled about this. And they turned their backs on them and bared their bottoms. And this is the cartoon. They'd had enough of being preached at. So I really like that cartoon. Like, you just shut up and stop talking a lot of drivel. But while I was doing my research into women, I came across this document, which is a list of 20 women convicts under sentence of transportation in Lancaster on the 15th of May 1824. The top two had been there for 6 years under the 7-year sentences, and they've just been given pardons and let out. The oldest convict is 76 on this list. But she might actually, because she's been there 3 years already, she might actually be 79, because quite often the age is shown on records are the age when they're convicted, as opposed to the age, the date of the document. So you're never quite certain. That's quite frightening, really, if you think about it. But at the bottom, there's an NB, if you can see. Number 8, Mary Partridge is a strong, healthy woman who wishes to go abroad. What on earth can that mean? So if you look up to number 8, it says Mary Partridge the elder, 52, convicted of burglary, been sentenced to death, which had been respited to transportation for life. Well, is Lancaster really that awful that she wants to go abroad? So I did some research into Mary Partridge and her story, and it's quite a story. It's quite a remarkable story, in fact. In February 1823, Mary, plus her daughters, Mary and Ellen, were sent to Lancaster Castle, charged with breaking and entering into a house in Liverpool. At April of the trial, the youngest daughter, Ellen, was acquitted of being an accessory before the fact. Mary, her daughter Mary, plus 2 other men and a woman, were found guilty and all sentenced to death, and those sentences were commuted to transportation for life. Ellen returned to Liverpool, immediately got into trouble again, and at Liverpool Court of Sessions in the July was sentenced to 7 years transportation for larceny, together with a certain John Rudd. Mary the younger was sent to the Brothers convict ship in November 1823, which was bound for Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania. Mary would have gone from Lancaster Castle. So was her sister Ellen, but Ellen would have been sent from Kirkdale Jail in Liverpool. Mary died on board on the 1st of April 1824. Now, all the convict ships had a naval surgeon superintendent on board who kept a log, and those logs can be very interesting and illuminating. And you're going to have to excuse my pronunciation here, but the surgeon's log says that Mary was suffering from sanguineous congestion in pulmone, and adds that since on board, she had suffered in silent grief from being separated from her mother. So says her sister, who was a girl of different habits. The inference being that although she has some kind of pulmonary congestion, she did not have the will to fight it. She'd actually been in the sick bay for about 3 months with this pulmonary disease. Mary the elder was sent to the Grenada convict ship in September 1824, which arrived in Sydney in January 1825. However, before it sailed and whilst it was at Woolwich, she wrote to the Home Office before departure, and this is the letter she wrote. That's her own handwriting, and it's written to the Home Secretary. And what she says to this letter was she asked him to be forwarded to her daughters in Van Diemen's Land. She knew that they'd sailed on the Brothers, and she said that they had written to her saying they had been promised that she would be sent there also. She also said that she had a son on board the Dolphin prison hulk at Chatham, and she hoped he would be allowed to follow her. His name was John Rudd, who was the chap who'd been convicted with Ellen at Liverpool. And that if this would happen, she promised to make amends. It's quite an amazing letter if you think about this, and it also tells you that the convicts were actually writing backwards and forwards to one another. They were communicating to each other, so that there's lots of bits of information you can gather from that you might not have thought about. But she obviously didn't know that her daughter, Mary, had died. John Rudd was actually pardoned from the captivity hulk in August 1828, so he wasn't sent out to Australia, and he was moved from the Dolphin hulk to the captivity hulk, which is quite a common thing that happened. When she arrived in Sydney, she was assigned to the Ogilvies in New South Wales. Now, the Ogilvies had been free emigrant passengers on the Grenada, and she'd become very friendly with them on the Grenada. Now, that might sound odd to you, convict becoming friendly with free passengers. But I actually understand that she was the cook. She'd become the cook on the Grenada, and she'd made a great friend of Mrs. Ogilvie, and the Ogilvies became quite prominent citizens in New South Wales. And through this friendship, she was able to lobby and petition the governor of New South Wales to be reunited with Ellen. And the first petitions were that she should be sent to Van Diemen's Land to be with Ellen, and that was rejected. And then subsequent petitions were for Ellen to be sent to New South Wales, and they were successful ultimately, because Ellen arrived in September 1827, and she was assigned to the Ogilvies. Ellen married one of the Ogilvies' other servants, and Mary died in 1851 and Ellen in 1854. Contemporary records describe Mary as a formidable woman, which I think is a pretty fair description of her, and a gigantic woman who stood 6 feet in her stockings. Ellen, I think, was quite a little lady from all accounts. So what I want then to look at is, I've got a draft going of a location specific and dealing with more than transportation, but I've been stymied now because of the closure of record offices. And the location I know a lot about is Carnarvonshire, because that's where my father was from. And I spent many years holidaying there. And so it's got the snappy title, Carnarvonshire Black Caps and Transportation between 1820 and 1841. And you might think she's nuts, writing about 21 years. But Carnarvonshire was a very law-abiding county. So we've actually only got 80 cases, which is a lot less than the Mangles. In that time, there were 26 people sentenced to death, but only one was executed, and 54 were sentenced to transportation. But obviously, of those 26 sentenced to death, those sentences were commuted to different things. So some of those were transportation and others were just jail. So the majority of the convicts came from North Wales, but 10 did not. Some of them came from England, one was from Preston. One came from Ireland, one came from America. And that nearly resulted in a diplomatic incident. There are telegrams flying backwards and forwards between the American consul in Liverpool and the Foreign Office about that case. I'll deal with now with the man who was executed, because I think that throws up some interesting things about difference between today and then in different aspects. On the 19th of August 1822, he was 26 and he was found guilty of highway robbery and the attempted murder of an exciseman. So he wasn't guilty of murder. A petition was raised to try and save him. Now they call them petitions because there was no appeal courts. You petitioned the king for the king's mercy. It was sent to the king by the minister from his home parish near Capel Cerrig, and it was signed by about 30 locals. Capel Cerrig is roughly between Bangor and Besticoed on the A5, about halfway. The 26th of August, so 7 days later, it had got to London. It was sent to the presiding judge, who said, "Here's the appeal, tell us if we should grant it." On the 2nd of September, the Home Department wrote to the parish minister rejecting the appeal. And on the 4th of September, he was executed. So really tight. You think about that in terms of bureaucracy today, to get, to marshal the answers, the responses, the roads, and the distances between London and North Wales of getting these things just wouldn't happen. Let alone the sort of the time frames for all these to take place. The petition was raised on the basis that he'd fought in the Battle of New Orleans in America, which took place in 1815, and been wounded there, and that later on he'd been wounded at home as well, and that also that there'd been no execution in Carnarvonshire for 20 years because it was such a law-abiding county, but obviously it failed. So it was witnessed by 12,000 people. In 1841, the population of Llanbeblig, which is the parish of Carnarvon town, was only 9,000 people. So again, phenomenal number of people compared to the size of the town turned up to watch it. He was very stoical about it, actually. And he told the crowd that they should take warning from his end, which he blamed solely on drunkenness, profanation of the Sabbath, and abandoned prostitutes. So he accepted his fate. And this is one that amused me. It was John Julian, the Irishman who insulted the judiciary and the Welsh. He was found guilty of obtaining money by false pretences and sentenced to be transported for 7 years. But he and various associates launched at least 2 appeals alleging bias, prejudice and bigotry against the Welsh jury, judicial system and the people in general. He complained that the judge's summing up had to be translated into Welsh because not all the jurors understood English. Now that surprised me that not all the jurors understood English, because I would have thought they would have been aldermen and therefore would have been bilingual. But in those days, as I understand it, the qualification for being a juror relates to property, so perhaps it wasn't necessary to be bilingual. But actually, I like the fact that there were translators in the court, because I knew that most of the defendants would not have been bilingual, and I knew that the judges, nor would the judges have been bilingual. So at least I knew that defendants wouldn't have been disadvantaged. I'm not too bothered about Mr. Julian. One of his associates suggested somehow or other that the Welch jury, as he called them, were all employed by and thus influenced by the Bangor banker. Dun, 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 dun. I think the Bangor banker was the man who'd been swindled, but I don't think they could have been influenced by them. Julian wrote to the Marquis of Anglesey, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and he said, "Your petitioner is emboldened to address your lordship on this his unfortunate situation, from his knowledge of your lordship's connection to this country, but you must be aware of the manner in which the laws are administered by ignorant men, biased by certain natural prejudice and actuated by a spirit of ill will towards every person not of their own country and acquaintance." The appeal was destined to fail because it impugned the judge, the jury, and the judicial system, something that was never ever done. Appeals never challenged the validity of the verdict. They never impugned the system. If you were going to appeal, you didn't appeal. You threw yourself on the clemency of the mercy of the king, and you really asked for clemency of the sentence, clemency to be able to serve your sentence in this country, or a reduction in the sentence. You never challenged the verdict, so it was never going to work. So he was a lost cause before he started. I thought you'd like to know a bit about Lancashire, so I did a bit of research on Lancashire in 1826. I just picked the year quite randomly, and you can see there's quite a difference between Lancashire and Carnarvonshire. And you can see that in 1 year in Lancashire, I should say that Lancaster had a fearsome reputation as a hanging town, by the way. It said that more people were hanged in Lancaster than anywhere in the country, save for London. There were 2,380 trials in 1826. You see, most of them were men rather than women. They had a pretty good chance of being found guilty, as you can see. The no bill means that basically there was not enough evidence to be presented at that time, but it left the door open if the prosecutors wanted to bring a charge another day. In terms of punishments, well, I think fines you can almost discount because there are only 4 of those, but imprisonments range from 1 day to 3 years. You can also get a whipping, either 1 or 2 whippings. Now, I've never quite worked out what a whipping consisted of because it doesn't seem to be prescribed as to the number of strokes. So, transportation, it was always either 7 years, 14 years, or life. And then death. There were 96 death sentences passed that year, and only of whom 4 were executed. But if you compare that to Carnarvonshire over the 21-year period, you had 54 transportation sentences versus 288 in 1 year, 96 death sentences versus the 26. And obviously, there's a difference because of the size of the population and the industrialisation of Lancashire. But there is a particular issue, as you're going to see in a minute, as to why this was a particular year with so many death sentences and so many transported. So these are the crimes and I've grouped them together just to make it easier, otherwise there'd be too many. And some of them you will recognise, some of them you might not recognise. So, you know, being at large under sentence of transportation, body stealing, classic 19th century crime. Very popular crimes at this time were the counterfeiting of coins, forgery, fraud, highway robbery. The one that's unique to this year is the machine breaking, and we'll come on to that separately, I think, talk about that. You can see there are only 5 murders. I say only 5, but it's not many, is it? Poaching, these were the offences against the game laws, which were ramping up in severity at that time. Stealing lead affixed to a building, that was a very common crime as well this time, and the biggest number were theft. So these are the crimes where death sentences were commuted. So you can see again, it's the machine breaking is the one that dominates here across there. And that's what I want to come on to talk about later on. So what if you got a death sentence and it was commuted? What happened to you? Well, it's a huge range, as you can see here. There's no anything from 3 months hard labour to life, just being transported for life. And for everything other than, again, put machine breaking to one side, basically anything here relates to your previous criminal record, your previous, what they knew of you as a person. The machine breaking, in my view, was politically motivated. They wanted to make examples of people. The rest of it is about, well, he hadn't, this was his first offence, or this wasn't his first offence. Because the sentences, like the animal theft ones, they were mandated by law. The death sentence was a mandate, and then the rest was based off the judge's recommendation, the respited sentences. The wounding down the bottom there, unknown. I've not really been able to work it out properly, and I think he was insane, and I think he ended up in a lunatic asylum, I think. So transportation outcomes. What happened if you were sentenced to be transported? Well, some of you may not know that you could actually be sent to Bermuda. Well, it's the men, anyway. They were sent to Bermuda because they used the convicts to build the naval stations out there. It wasn't a nice place to be sent. In fact, it was a very unpleasant place to be sent because of the climate. Neither the convicts nor the prison guards liked it. They were housed on old boats out there, old ships, again, hulks, and it was quite a high death rate out there because of the climate. They could spend their time in prison, either locally, like Lancaster, or they could be sent down to the General Penitentiary, which was also called Millbank. And that was on the banks of the Thames. Today you'll find it's where Tate Britain stands. Or they could spend their time on the hulks, which would be on the Thames, the Medway, down at Portsmouth or at Plymouth, Devonport, places like that. Or the bulk of them were transported to New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land. So machine breaking. This is the unique one to 1826, and this really is actually the mill riots that afflicted this part of the country. And these weren't really part of the Luddite movement. They arose from pure hardship and destitution in the April of that year. Wages had dropped by about 2/3. Food prices had doubled. Unemployment in some areas was 60%. People were working ridiculous hours and still needing poor relief. This had been going on for 10 years or more, but it had really deteriorated badly in the last 18 months. The appeals to government had fallen on deaf ears. Rioting broke out in April and continued over several days, with the mills being attacked and destroyed. Newspaper reports say that at times the mob was about 20,000 strong. They say that 1,139 looms were destroyed in Accrington, Oswaldtwistle, Blackburn, Darwin, Rossendale, Bury and Chorley. The mill here was Lightoller and Harrison on Water Street. There were 6 people killed by troops in Rossendale, many more wounded. There were government agents in the mob who acted as witnesses against the 68 people who stood trial at Lancaster in August. They may well also acted as agents provocateurs. The mill owners were compensated via levies on the rates to enable them to restock the mills. And somebody has done a study which says that between May and September 1826, 35 children under the age of 4 died in Haslington. Between December 1826 and March 1827, there were 107 people buried in Haslington churchyard. And that can only be through starvation. After all this, a number of manufacturers subsequently agreed to pay a standard rate to the weavers, but on their own admission it was a starvation wage. The manufacturers who stuck to the agreement found it difficult to compete with those who didn't stick to it. So there were those who were paying below starvation wages. And they appealed to the President of the Board of Trade to introduce a legally binding minimum wage. But his response was dismissive. He expressed the view that to introduce such a measure would be a vain and hazardous attempt to impose the authority of the law between the labourer and his employer in regulating the demand for labour and the price to be paid for it. It's pretty appalling, really. I'm sure that somebody could do a whole presentation on this subject ad infinitum. Even the judge was very, who sentenced these guys to death before commuting them their sentences to life for transportation for life, was actually quite sympathetic. But he felt he had no choice. I've got an article from a newspaper which is a transcription of his speech, but I haven't got time to read it out because we're overrunning probably. It's quite a long speech, but it's quite a sympathetic one. I can let people have that if they'd like it. I don't know which newspaper it's from, but it was printed in Glasgow, so it's probably one of the regional papers. So I want to conclude now by just telling you that this is why I'm addicted to crime, because I'm just fascinated by these stories. It gives me, an insight into daily life that I really wouldn't be available to me as just a normal family historian. I just concentrate on my own law-abiding family, apart from John David, of course, who wasn't law-abiding. And I am addicted because I float like a butterfly. I pick up bits here and there, and I really need to decide to focus what I should focus on and concentrate on next. So just watch that space, and thank you very much for listening. And I hope I haven't sent you to sleep. And if you've got any questions, please ask.